clearing. Before there was a village, there was only forest. Tall, patient trees stood where the cottages would one day rest. Their roots ran deep into dark soil that had never known the edge of a plough. The wind moved through branches with a slow, whispering sound, uninterrupted by chimney smoke, unbroken by human routine. There were no paths yet, no worn tracks between doorways, no fences marking ownership. Only earth, only sky, only time passing quietly. It began with 5 families. They did not arrive all at once. They came slowly, over the course of one spring, following a narrow trading road that curved along the edge of a shallow valley. The valley was not remarkable. It was not wide enough to inspire awe, nor steep enough to intimidate. A small stream crossed its center, moving with patient certainty toward a distant river. The soil, when tested by hand, felt heavy and dark. That was enough. The first tree was cut at dawn. The sound of iron striking wood echoed through the valley with a rhythm that would, in time, become familiar. At first, the forest resisted. Branches tangled. Roots refused to release their hold. Trunks fell with a force that shook the ground and startled birds into the air. But day after day, the clearing widened. Sunlight touched earth that had not seen direct light in decades. The air changed. It carried the scent of fresh wood and turned soil. The first cottage was not beautiful. It was practical. Wooden beams joined with simple pegs, walls packed with mud and straw, a roof layered with thatch thick enough to withstand rain. It leaned slightly to one side, but it stood. That was enough. The man who built it had never owned land before. He had worked fields belonging to another lord, far beyond the forest ridge. But here, under agreement with a minor noble whose lands stretched thin and distant, he was permitted to settle, to clear, to build, to plant. Ownership in the medieval sense was never complete, but it was close enough to feel like something new. He stood outside the finished structure one evening, hands resting against his hips, looking at the doorway as if expecting it to speak back to him. Behind him, smoke rose faintly from a small fire. Beside him, his wife carried a wooden bucket toward the stream, stepping carefully over uneven ground that would soon become a path. They did not speak much. There was too much to do. By midsummer, 3 cottages stood. By harvest time, there were 5. The forest still surrounded them on all sides, but the center of the valley had begun to change shape. A rough, common space formed between the homes, not planned, but created by repetition. Children ran between doorways. Water was carried from the same bend in the stream. Firewood was stacked in similar places. Patterns formed. Patterns always form. The first fields were small. Clearing enough land to plant grain required effort that stretched beyond daylight. Tree stumps remained in the soil, like stubborn reminders of what the land had been. The plough caught against hidden roots. Oxen pulled slowly, breathing heavily under the late summer sun. Still, rows appeared, uneven, imperfect, but real. Seed was scattered by hand, with emotion passed down through generations long before this valley was chosen. Step, scatter, step, scatter. The rhythm was older than the village itself. Autumn came gently. The first harvest was modest. No one had expected abundance. The grain stood shorter than in older settlements. The soil needed time to understand its new purpose. But when bundles were tied and carried back toward the cottages, there was a quiet satisfaction in the air. They would eat through winter. That was enough. The first winter tested them. Snow fell heavily across the clearing, softening sharp edges of newly cut wood and half-finished fences. The cottages held. Smoke rose from each roof, thin but steady. Inside, space felt smaller than it had during summer. Work moved inward. Tools were repaired near the fire. Clothing was mended in dim light. Stories were spoken softly, not for entertainment, but for continuity. Outside, the forest stood unchanged. The village, though small, had begun to exist. In early spring, something unexpected happened. A traveller stopped. He had been walking toward the distant town beyond the ridge when he noticed smoke in the valley. Smoke meant people. People meant food, or trade, or at the very least, conversation. He stayed only one night, but he carried news. He spoke of shifting borders between minor lords, of taxes rising in older villages, of sickness in a settlement farther east, not widespread, but present. The 5 families listened carefully. This valley felt distant from such movement. Yet even here, the world would reach them eventually. It always does. Spring returned fully. The ground softened. The ploughs moved again. The clearing expanded further into the forest. What had begun as 5 cottages slowly became something more organized. A shared well was dug closer to the center. A rough wooden cross was placed near the common space, a marker of faith and of permanence. Children grew taller, new infants were born, and the sound of axes became less frequent as fields replaced trees. Years passed quietly, not dramatically, not with great events, but with steady repetition. Planting, harvesting, repairing, waiting. The first generation did not think of themselves as founders. They thought of themselves as survivors. Yet without announcing it, they had created something that would remain long after them. A village does not begin with ceremony. It begins with repetition, with shared labor, with smoke rising from more than one chimney, with footsteps wearing the same path into the earth. And as the sun set one evening over the small clearing, 5 cottages standing in patient silence beneath a widening sky, the valley no longer felt untouched. It felt inhabited. It felt claimed, not by power, but by persistence. This was only the beginning. The forest still waited at the edges. The seasons would turn again and again. Children would become adults. Fields would widen. And over the next 100 years, this quiet clearing would learn what it means to endure. The first harvest failure. The second year began with confidence. The fields were wider now, the stumps fewer. The soil turned more deeply than before. Experience, or even a small amount of it, creates a quiet form of hope. The men rose earlier that spring. The women organized seed stores more carefully. Children were given small tasks, collecting stones from the fields, carrying kindling, watching younger siblings near the stream. The valley felt less like an experiment and more like a beginning. And yet, the land does not respond to confidence. It responds only to weather. The rains came late. At first, no one worried. Spring often hesitated before committing fully to warmth. Clouds gathered, drifted, then dissolved without releasing water. The soil dried at its surface. Small cracks appeared between rows of newly planted grain. Still, the roots searched downward. Still, the villagers waited. Waiting is a skill learned slowly. By early summer, the stream ran thinner. Its edges retreated inward, exposing dark stones that had remained hidden in previous months. The well, dug carefully in the common space, required deeper pulling. Buckets returned heavier with silence than with water. The sky remained wide and pale, Wind moved across the valley, but it carried no storm. The grain did not fail all at once. It simply stopped growing. Green faded to a muted yellow, too early in the season. Stalks stood shorter than they should have. Heads formed but lightly. When the first handful was tested between calloused fingers, the seeds felt smaller than memory suggested they should. No one spoke of failure yet, but silence stretched longer during evening meals. Harvest time arrived anyway. The act of cutting grain continued, because there was nothing else to do. Bundles were tied and gathered. Carts moved slowly between rows. From a distance, the fields looked almost the same as the year before. But inside each bundle, there was less weight, less promise. When grain was measured and stored, the truth settled quietly among them. There would not be enough to carry easily through winter. Hunger in a medieval village does not arrive dramatically. It begins with smaller bowls, with bread stretched thinner, with porridge mixed more heavily with water. The children noticed first. They asked for more. They were told gently to wait. Waiting again. Autumn brought no relief. The forest still bordered the clearing, but game was scarce. Traps returned empty, more often than not. The traveller road remained silent that season. No merchants passed close enough to trade surplus, because there was no surplus to trade. Each household began counting quietly. How many sacks of grain? How many dried vegetables? How many salted scraps remained? The numbers were not comforting. Winter arrived earlier than expected. Cold moved down from the hills before the final leaves had fallen. Frost formed on the inside edges of windows. Breath lingered visibly, even indoors. The cottages held as they had the year before, but the air inside felt different, less certain. Meals became measured events. Bread cut precisely. Soup ladled carefully. Nothing wasted. Even crumbs were saved. And yet, something else began to form during those long evenings. The 5 families stopped thinking only in terms of their own stores. They began thinking collectively. Grain was redistributed quietly, a little from one home, a little from another. The widow, whose harvest had been smallest, received extra without public discussion. The man whose ox had fallen ill was given help repairing his plough in preparation for the coming spring. Hardship, when shared, reshapes boundaries. The village began to act less like 5 households and more like one body. Midwinter tested them hardest. One child fell ill, not from plague or dramatic disease, but from weakness. Food was redirected again. Broth simmered longer than usual. Firewood was shared between cottages to conserve warmth. The forest remained silent outside, as if watching without comment. Snow covered the fields evenly, erasing the memory of the failed harvest beneath it. Under that white surface, the soil waited patiently for another chance. Late in winter, the rains finally came. Not heavy, not destructive, just steady. Snow softened, ice retreated. The stream swelled gently, filling its banks once more. It was too late to change what had happened, but it was not too late to change what might come next. When spring returned, the village did not approach the fields with the same casual hope. They moved with caution. Seed was planted more carefully, spacing adjusted. Additional plots cleared closer to the stream where moisture lingered longer. Experience had deepened them. Failure had instructed them. The forest edge moved back another few steps. More land was opened. More effort invested. This time, the sky shifted differently. Clouds gathered early. Rain fell steadily through April and May. Green returned. Not all at once, but gradually, This second harvest would not be abundant, but it would be sufficient. And sufficiency, in a medieval village, is the closest thing to prosperity. Years later, the first harvest failure would not be remembered as a catastrophe. It would be remembered as a lesson. The valley had taught them something essential. The land gives. The land withholds. The land endures. And so must they. The clearing grew wider. The cottages stood firmer. And though none of them yet knew it, this small settlement had passed its first true test. It would not be the last. The first birth and the shape of family. By the third spring, the valley no longer felt temporary. Paths were visible even from the ridge above. Smoke rose at predictable hours. The clearing had edges now, not sharp, but defined by repetition. And in one of the cottages, life prepared to begin again. The first child born in the valley arrived during the soft rains of April. The labour was long, the cottage small, the air heavy with heat from the fire that had been kept burning through the night. Outside, the stream moved steadily, indifferent and constant. Inside, time slowed, while women from neighbouring cottages came quietly, bringing water, cloth, steady hands. The men waited outside, not from fear, but from tradition. Birth belonged to the interior space, to firelight, to whispered encouragement. When the cry finally came, it did not echo dramatically. It simply existed, a small sound, fragile, yet certain. The first child, born on land that had once been forest. He would never know the valley without cottages. He would never see it as a clearing. Whereas to him, this would simply be home. His cradle was carved from leftover wood of the first house beams. His blankets sewn from garments worn thin by labour. His world small and warm. The village shifted slightly around him. Schedules adjusted. Voices softened near his doorway. Tasks redistributed to allow his mother to recover. Birth changes more than a household. It changes rhythm. Within 2 years, another child was born. Then another. The valley began to fill, not only with work, but with sound. Laughter near the stream. Small arguments over stones and sticks. Bare feet running along dirt paths. Children marked permanence in a way buildings could not. They tied the future to the soil. The first generation aged almost without noticing. Lines deepened around eyes. Hands grew thicker from repetition. Shoulders settled lower after years of lifting and bending. But they were no longer only builders. They were parents. They began teaching in quiet ways. How to hold a wooden tool. How to judge soil moisture by touch. How to listen for approaching weather. Instruction was never formal. It occurred beside labour. Learning came through imitation. Summer that year was generous. Rain fell at balanced intervals. Grain rose taller than before. The children watched as harvest approached, their understanding limited but growing. They saw that food did not appear by chance. It was shaped by patience. When the bundles were tied and stacked, one of the older men lifted the firstborn child, now walking unsteadily, and let him touch the dry stalks. "This," he said softly, "is what keeps us." The child would not remember the words, but others did. Autumn evenings became gatherings, not celebrations in the grand sense, but moments of shared presence. Bread was broken. Stories exchanged. The memory of the first failed harvest still lingered, but it no longer carried fear. It carried awareness. The valley had taught them resilience early. Winter returned, as it always does, but this time there were more bodies inside each cottage, more breath warming the air. more blankets layered across shared beds. Hunger did not come that year. Not sharply. Food lasted long enough. The children grew through the cold months, their cheeks fuller than the year before, and the village exhaled slowly. With growth came new considerations. The clearing, once wide and empty, began to feel smaller. Fences were extended. A second well was discussed but postponed. Land, even in abundance, has limits when divided across generations. One evening near the end of winter, the 5 original settlers gathered without their children. They spoke not of immediate needs, but of the years ahead. What would happen when the boys reached adulthood? Would the valley hold enough fields for them? Would daughters marry within the settlement or leave beyond the ridge? The questions were quiet, not urgent yet, but present. Spring again. More trees fell at the edges. The forest retreated further, though never entirely. It remained a boundary, a reminder of what had been. The village now held 8 cottages, 3 new ones built by the younger hands under guidance of older eyes. The architecture improved slightly. Straighter beams, thicker walls. Experience accumulated like sediment in a riverbed. One afternoon, the firstborn child, now nearly 5, stood alone at the edge of the clearing. He looked toward the forest, curious but cautious. He had been told not to wander far, but he could sense its depth. Behind him lay order, fields in rows, smoke rising predictably, voices calling familiar names. Before him lay shadow and uncertainty. He turned back toward the cottages. The choice was instinctive. The village had already shaped him. By the end of the decade, the clearing no longer resembled its beginning. Paths were compacted firmly, the stream bank reinforced with simple stones. A modest wooden structure, larger than the others, stood at the center, serving as gathering place and shared storage. No one called it a hall, but it functioned as one. The valley, once unnamed, was spoken of beyond the ridge now. Travelers occasionally passed again. They noted its presence, its modest success. Some stayed. One family joined during the 11th year. The village grew to 9 cottages. Growth was not dramatic. It was incremental and steady. The first generation began to notice something else. The children no longer asked about the forest as if it were home. They asked about towns beyond the hills, about markets, about distant rivers. The world was expanding in their imagination, even as the village expanded physically. That too is part of growth. Roots deepen, but eyes lift. As the 12th winter approached, the valley felt stable, not wealthy, not powerful, but established. The first birth had become one of many. The first failed harvest had become a story. The clearing had become a village. And time, patient, indifferent, continuous, moved forward. The next years would bring change not from hunger or birth alone, but from the outside world slowly pressing inward. Taxes, rumors of conflict, distant illness. The valley could not remain untouched forever. No place can. But for now, in the quiet glow of firelight, with children sleeping beneath wool blankets and fields resting under frost, the village endured. And endurance in these early decades was everything. The weight of coin and obligation. The tax collector did not arrive with noise. There were no trumpets, no soldiers in shining armor, no banners announcing authority. He came on a grey morning in late autumn, riding a patient horse that seemed more accustomed to long roads than urgency. The villagers saw him before he reached the clearing. A single figure, emerging between trees, steady and unhurried. Children were called back toward cottages, tools lowered. The men stood together without speaking. Visitors were no longer rare, but officials were different from travellers. Travellers asked for bread. Officials asked for records. He dismounted near the central structure, the modest hall that had grown from shared storage. His clothing was practical, but well kept. Wool cloak, leather boots, a satchel secured carefully at his side. He greeted them without hostility, but not warmly either. He explained in measured tones that the land upon which they had settled belonged not to wilderness, but to a lord whose estate extended beyond the distant hills. Our ownership, he said gently, existed even where trees had stood. The clearing, the cottages, the fields, all were part of a larger map. And maps required accounting. The villagers listened. Some had expected this moment. Land rarely remains unnoticed forever. They had hoped, perhaps, that distance might grant exemption. It did not. The collector removed parchment from his satchel. Names were requested, not written by the villagers. Most could not write, but spoken aloud and recorded carefully. He counted cottages, estimated fields, asked about livestock. The questions were practical, the implications quiet but heavy. Payment would not be demanded in coin alone. Coin was scarce in small settlements. Instead, a portion of harvest would be expected each year. Grain measured. Eggs counted. Occasionally, labour requested for roads or fortifications far beyond the valley. The obligation was not crushing, but it was permanent. A thread now connected them to a distant authority. Invisible, but firm. After he left, the clearing felt altered. Nothing physical had changed. The cottages stood. The stream moved. But the sense of isolation, of existing outside larger systems, had dissolved. The valley was no longer simply theirs. It was part of something layered and hierarchical. The first generation gathered that evening inside the hall. Candles burned low. They discussed what portion could be given without risking winter scarcity. Calculations were made not with numbers, but with memory and instinct. How much grain had filled the store last year? How much had been required? Margins were thin, but manageable. For now. The first collection the following harvest was orderly. Bundles were set aside deliberately. Children watched as sacks were weighed. It was a new ritual, one that felt less satisfying than harvest itself. Giving to neighbours strengthened bonds. Giving to distant authority felt different, but resistance was not considered. Stability required cooperation, and the village all valued stability above pride. Years passed in this new rhythm. Plant, tend, harvest, set aside the portion owed. Winter, repeat. The children grew taller. The firstborn, now nearly 15, worked fields beside his father. His hands mirrored the older man's movements with increasing precision. He had never known the valley without obligation. To him, the tax was part of the pattern of seasons. Not an intrusion, just another layer of reality. Then came a year when rain arrived too heavily. Spring storms lingered longer than usual. The stream swelled beyond its banks. Lower fields flooded briefly, washing away early seedlings. The damage was not catastrophic, but yields would be smaller. The villagers knew this by midsummer. They adjusted meals accordingly, began conserving earlier. When harvest came, the sacks were lighter again, not as light as the first failed year, but noticeably reduced, and still, the collector would return. He arrived under clearer skies that autumn, older now. or perhaps simply more familiar. He dismounted, greeted them by name. The list was unrolled, expectations unchanged. The first generation's leader, the man who had felled the first tree in the clearing, spoke carefully. He explained the flooding, the reduced yield. He did not plead. He described. The collector listened. Silence followed. Authority is rarely loud. It rests in the ability to decide. After a pause, a slight adjustment was granted. A smaller portion accepted. But the message was clear. The obligation remained. Weather did not dissolve hierarchy. That winter felt heavier, not because of hunger, there was enough, but because the illusion of autonomy had faded entirely. The valley was connected to systems beyond its horizon. Wars might be fought elsewhere. Lords might change. Taxes might increase. Their lives, though small and rooted, were not insulated. The first generation understood this deeply now. And yet, life continued. Children married within the valley. One daughter left, walking beyond the ridge, with a trader's son toward a settlement nearer the river. Her departure marked another shift. The valley no longer only received life, it sent it outward. Seasons continued their rotation. The forest edge grew distant. Fields expanded further. The hall was reinforced with thicker beams. The village, though bound by obligation, was also strengthening. By the 20th year since the first tree fell, the original settlers carried grey in their hair. Their movements slower, their conversations longer. They had endured drought, flood, taxation, birth, and departure. The valley had become layered with memory. Paths were worn not only by feet, but by repetition of experience. The children, now adults, began speaking of improvement. A mill, perhaps, if the stream could support it. A larger gathering space. Ambitions modest, but forward-looking. The first generation listened, not resisting change, but aware of its cost. Time, patient as ever, shifted its focus. The years ahead would not test them only with weather or coin. Rumors began drifting through travelers. Whispers of illness in distant towns, of villages emptied quietly, not by war, but by something unseen. The valley heard these rumors as one hears distant thunder, not immediate, but approaching. The first generation had built something durable, but durability does not guarantee immunity. The next decades would challenge the village in ways fields and taxes never had, and the children who had grown beside the stream would face a world less predictable than the one their parents had cleared from forest. The valley rested beneath winter frost once more. Cottages stood in quiet formation. Smoke rose steadily. From above, it would look peaceful. And for now, it was. But change, as always, was already on its way. Rumors of illness and the expanding world. By the 25th year, the valley no longer felt young. It felt established. The first generation still lived, though more slowly now. The second generation carried most of the labor. The third ran barefoot between cottages, unaware that the village had ever been smaller. Fields stretched wider than memory could easily measure. Fences marked boundaries clearly. The stream powered a modest wooden mill, its wheel turning steadily through most seasons. Grain could now be ground more efficiently. Bread was less coarse than before. Time, in small increments, had improved comfort. Travellers passed more frequently too. A path had formed beyond the ridge, linking distant settlements like threads in a woven cloth. The valley was no longer isolated. It was a quiet knot in a larger network. and networks carry more than trade. The first rumour arrived with a wool merchant in early spring. He spoke casually while sharing stew near the hall fire. In a town 3 days east, he said, an illness had spread during winter. Nothing dramatic at first. Fever, weakness, a cough that lingered longer than it should. Several had died, not many, but more than usual. The villagers listened politely. Illness was not unfamiliar. Winters often claimed the elderly or the very young, but something in the merchant's tone suggested this was different. He did not linger long the next morning. Travellers rarely do, but his words remained after he left. Summer came bright and warm. Crops rose strong under generous rain. The mill wheel turned with steady rhythm. Children swam in the shallows of the stream, their laughter carrying across fields. The rumour faded into background thought. Distance provides comfort. If sickness exists beyond the hills, it belongs to beyond the hills. Life continued. Then another traveller arrived. A man on foot, clothes worn thinner than expected for the season. He asked for water first, then bread. His voice carried fatigue deeper than hunger. In his village, he explained, the fever had returned in spring after seeming to vanish in winter. This time it spread more quickly. Entire households weakened at once. Some recovered, some did not. The priest in his village had spoken of divine testing. The healer had burned herbs in doorways. Neither explanation changed outcomes. Farmod the traveller did not stay long either. He was moving west, away from where he had begun. The valley listened more carefully now, at the well, in the fields, near the mill. Conversations lowered in tone. The older generation remembered stories from their own childhoods of sickness, moving through regions like unseen wind. They had hoped such stories would remain stories. But distance was shrinking each year. Paths connected them more tightly to the world. Connection brings opportunity. It also brings exposure. Autumn approached with steady normalcy. Harvest was good. Taxes collected without conflict. The collector mentioned nothing unusual in his ledger. If illness troubled other regions, official records did not yet reflect alarm. Still, the village made subtle adjustments. Visitors were greeted kindly, but observed more carefully. Shared cups were rinsed more thoroughly. Children were called closer when strangers passed. Precautions quiet and practical. No panic, only awareness. Winter arrived early that year, colder than usual. Snow settled thick along the forest edge. Jeep travel slowed. Fewer strangers crossed the ridge. The valley folded inward again, as it had in earlier years. There is safety in winter isolation. Illness travels poorly through heavy snow. For a time, it seemed the rumours would dissolve like frost in sunlight. Then, in late winter, the miller's youngest daughter developed a fever. At first, it appeared ordinary. Children often grew warm during cold months. She rested near the hearth, wrapped in wool blankets. Her mother cooled her forehead with damp cloth. But the fever did not break. It deepened. A cough followed. Not sharp, but persistent. Within days, her older brother began coughing too. The valley shifted its attention fully inward. The traveller's word had returned in memory. Fever. Weakness. Lingering breath. The illness did not move violently. It moved slowly, one household at a time. The elderly man who had cut the first tree fell ill next. His breathing grew shallow. His strength faded as though winter had entered his bones. The village did not have physicians. Knowledge came from experience, from herbs gathered near the stream, from whispered prayers spoken beside beds. Some recovered. After long days of weakness, they returned to fields thinner, but alive. Others did not. The miller's daughter passed quietly, one grey morning. No dramatic final words. Only stillness. The first death in the valley not caused by age or accident. The first taken by something invisible. Burial took place near the forest edge. A simple marker carved from wood. Snow fell lightly during the ceremony. The village stood in silence. Children sensed the shift, even if they did not understand its scale. Loss introduces a new dimension to place. The valley now held not only life and labour, but memory, shaped by absence. Spring eventually came. The fever receded as suddenly as it had risen. No explanation offered. No clear pattern identified. It simply diminished. The surviving recovered strength slowly. Fields demanded attention again. Seeds waited for planting. Life, persistent as ever, resumed its rhythm. But something fundamental had changed. The villagers understood now that they were not merely vulnerable to weather and tax. They were vulnerable to breath itself, to proximity, to the simple act of sharing space. And yet, they did not withdraw from one another. They could not. Survival required cooperation. Fields required many hands. The mill required maintenance. Children required guidance. Isolation within the village was impossible. Instead, they absorbed the lesson quietly. Life is fragile. Community is essential. Risk is constant. By the 30th year, the valley had endured illness and emerged altered but intact. Population had not grown as quickly as expected. A few cottages stood emptier than before. But the structure of the village remained. Stronger in some ways, more cautious in others. The first generation, now elderly, spoke less often. They had witnessed the forest become field, the field become village, and the village face forces beyond plough and coin. They had built something resilient, but resilience, they knew, does not prevent hardship. It only shapes response. Summer returned warm and steady. Children once again ran near the stream. The mill wheel turned. Smoke rose predictably. From a distance, nothing suggested vulnerability. The valley appeared peaceful, and for the moment, it was. But growth continued. New births would come. New tensions would emerge. And beyond the ridge, the wider world kept moving. Sometimes toward them, sometimes away. The division of land and the quiet strain between brothers' time did what it always does. It moved. The children who had once run barefoot through shallow water now stood taller than their fathers had at the same age. Their hands were broad, their backs strong. They knew the fields as instinctively as they knew their own breath. The valley, however, had not grown as quickly as they had. Land can be cleared, but it cannot be multiplied without effort. And effort has limits. The first generation had divided fields simply. Each household worked what it could manage. There was space then, room to expand, room to experiment. Now, the boundaries felt closer. Stones marked edges carefully. Fences repaired more often. Paths adjusted to avoid disputes. The issue emerged quietly. The two brothers, sons of the firstborn child, shared a field aid inherited from their father. In youth, shared labour had been natural. They rose together or ploughed together, harvested side by side. But as their own children grew, so did their needs. One brother had 4 sons, the other 2 daughters, and an infant. Grain must be portioned carefully when mouths multiply. The conversation began politely. Perhaps the field could be divided more clearly. Perhaps one might claim the northern section, the other the southern. The soil quality differed slightly, the southern ground richer from older flooding. Neither brother mentioned this at first. They both knew. The village council, informal but respected, met inside the hall. Voices remained calm. No accusations. Only practical discussion. Division, once made, would be permanent. It would shape not only yield, but inheritance. The elder of the first generation, now frail but still observant, spoke quietly. When we cleared this land, it was forest. It did not belong to any one of us. We worked together because we had to. Now you ask to separate because you can. No anger, only memory. The younger men listened. They respected him deeply, but necessity presses harder than nostalgia. Finally, agreement was reached. The field would be divided evenly by measure, not by soil quality. The northern half, slightly larger in size to compensate for lesser fertility. It seemed fair. On parchment, it would have appeared balanced. But fairness does not always remove feeling. In the first year after division, harvest from the southern field was visibly stronger. The difference small, but noticeable. The brother with 4 sons worked harder to compensate, clearing a thin strip nearer the forest edge. The labor was heavy, roots thick, progress slow. He said nothing publicly, but tension has a texture. It can be sensed in silence. At the well, conversations shifted. Small comments, carefully phrased observations. Nothing confrontational. Yet a subtle awareness formed within the village. Unity, once automatic, now required maintenance. The second generation had inherited land. The third would expect the same. Division would repeat, each generation narrower in margin than the last. The mill added complexity. Ownership had never been formalized. The stream powered it, but the labor to build it had been shared. Now maintenance required consistent attention. Who would repair broken paddles? Who would collect grain for grinding first in lean seasons? Questions of order become questions of power if ignored. The council established a rotation. Each household granted equal access by schedule. It functioned. But again, cooperation required structure now, not instinct. Meanwhile, beyond the ridge, changes stirred. Lords shifted alliances. Rumors of skirmishes traveled the trade paths. The tax collector mentioned possible increases to support distant fortifications. The valley listened with restrained concern. They had little influence beyond their fields, but influence was not required to feel impact. One summer evening, after a long day repairing fencing, the 2 brothers sat beside the stream. Silence stretched between them. Finally, the younger spoke. "We used to finish each other's rows," he said quietly. The elder nodded. "We still can," he replied. And they did. During harvest that year, though fields were separate, they worked together when storms threatened. Division did not erase blood, but it required intention to preserve harmony. The next generation watched all of this closely. Children observe more than adults realize. They learn not only how to sow seed, but how to negotiate space, how to manage disagreement without fracture. The village matured socially, not only physically. Hardship does that. It forces clarity. By the 35th yaw since the first tree fell, the valley held more people than ever before. But it also held less land per person. Cottages were expanded vertically where possible. Lofts built for sleeping children. Storage tightened. Efficiency improved. Waste reduced. There was no excess, but there was stability, for now. Then came a summer of unusual heat. The stream thinned earlier than expected. The mill wheel slowed. Grain growth appeared uneven. It was not drought, not fully, but it was warning. Land divided too finely struggles under stress. The council met again. And this time, the question was not about splitting fields. It was about whether one son might leave to seek opportunity in a larger town. Migration, once rare, became consideration. The valley had been built from departure. Now departure might preserve it. The brother with 4 sons volunteered his 3rd child. The boy, 16, strong, uncertain, would travel east after harvest to apprentice with a blacksmith in a growing market town. It was not exile, it was expansion. The valley exhaled quietly in relief. One less mouth to feed, one connection outward. Perhaps coin might return someday. Autumn arrived steady and moderate. The stream regained strength. Harvest sufficient, if not abundant. The young apprentice left on a clear morning. His mother cried softly. His father stood firm. The path beyond the ridge no longer symbolized threat alone. It symbolized possibility. The valley had entered a new phase. Not merely surviving, not merely growing, but adjusting deliberately. Land could not stretch infinitely, but community could adapt. Division, illness, taxation, migration, all threads now woven into its identity. The forest edge stood farther away than ever. Yet the sense of boundary had shifted inward. The greatest limits were no longer trees. They were resources, relationships, and time. Winter approached once more. Cottages held layered generations. Stories of the early forest days sounded almost mythical to children who had never seen that wilderness. The first generation, few remaining, rested often now. They had witnessed transformation beyond expectation. Their hands, once instruments of clearing, now trembled slightly at rest. They knew something the young did not fully grasp. Every settlement faces a turning point, a moment when expansion slows and preservation begins. The valley stood near that threshold, the year the river changed course. It happened slowly. At first, no one noticed. The stream that had powered the mill for nearly 3 decades ran slightly higher during spring thaw. That was not unusual. Snowmelt often swelled its banks. But this year, the current pressed harder against the eastern curve, where soil had grown soft from years of erosion. The elders saw it. Water reshapes land with patience, not force, and patience always wins. Through early summer, the current carved deeper. The bank slumped in small increments. A tree tilted. Roots exposed. Children were warned to stay clear. By midsummer, the bend widened. The flow straightened, subtly redirecting itself. The mill wheel turned unevenly, not broken, but strained. The miller adjusted the paddles, reinforced the supports, but the truth was clear. The stream that had once been stable was rewriting its path. Then came the storm. Not the worst the valley had seen, but long, 3 days of relentless rain. The soil, already weakened, gave way during the second night. Half the eastern bank collapsed. Water surged into a new channel. By morning, the stream no longer curved near the mill. It had shifted 10 paces east. The mill wheels stood in shallow trickle, silent. Silence where there had once been rhythm. That was what unsettled them most. The mill had become the valley's heartbeat. Its steady turning had marked work, marked progress, marked identity. Now it stood motionless. The structure itself remained intact, but without water. It was only wood. The council gathered immediately. The first generation's last surviving elder, was carried on a stool to the doorway of the hall so he could witness the discussion. Options were considered: divert the stream back, dig a new channel. The labour required would be immense, and success uncertain. Water follows gravity, not intention. The younger men examined the new course carefully. The redirected stream flowed stronger there, deeper, narrower. If a new mill were built downstream along the altered path, it might function better than before. But that meant abandoning the old structure, abandoning effort layered across years, abandoning memory embedded in beams. Change demands sacrifice, even when practical. The decision took 2 days, not because it was unclear, but because it was heavy. The old mill would remain standing as storage. A new one would be built where the water now flowed. The valley would not fight the rivers. It would follow it. Construction began before summer ended. The young apprentice who had left years earlier returned unexpectedly that autumn. Stronger, skilled. He brought tools unfamiliar to some, iron fittings crafted with precision. He had earned coin in the town. He had learned new methods. He stood now beside his father and uncles, helping raise a stronger frame over the new current. Departure had become return. Expansion had strengthened preservation. The new mill stood taller, more stable. The wheel turned faster along the narrower flow. Grain ground more efficiently than before. The valley adapted. Again. But adaptation always carries cost. The eastern field nearest the old stream bend lost fertile soil during the collapse. Yield from that section diminished permanently. The brother who owned that portion accepted it quietly. He had sons grown now. One would leave next year for apprenticeship as well. Land lost could be balanced by skill gained. The valley was learning a deeper truth. Survival was no longer about holding ground. It was about adjusting to its movement. Winter came gently that year. Snow light. The new mill wheel creaked softly under frost. Inside cottages, 3 generations shared stories by firelight. The first generation's final elder passed that winter. Not from illness, not from hardship, but from age. He died in his sleep, in the valley he'd carved from forest. They buried him near the original forest edge, now distant from fields, but still visible as a dark line against the hills. His marker faced the stream's new course, as if even in rest, he acknowledged change. By the 40th year since the first tree fell, the valley was no longer fragile. It was not wealthy, not powerful, not immune to difficulty, but it was rooted, not in fixed geography, for even rivers shift, but in pattern, work, adapt, share, endure. Children born now heard stories of a time when the land had been forest, when there was no mill, no hall, no path beyond the ridge. To them, these tales felt almost mythical, yet the evidence surrounded them daily, in worn tools, in weathered beams, in names spoken at supper that belonged to those no longer present. The valley had become layered time, each generation adding structure without erasing what came before. And beyond the ridge, the world continued its own restless movement. Lords would rise and fall. Wars would come and pass. In illness would return in other forms. Markets would expand. Empires would draw lines across maps. But here, in this clearing once carved from trees, life would remain measured not by empire, but by seasons, by seed and harvest, by birth and burial, by river and repair. In the end, nothing grand marked the valley's endurance. No monument, no record in distant archives, only continuity, smoke rising each morning, fields tilled again and again, a mill wheel turning where water allowed it, and families who understood, without needing to say it aloud. Peace is not the absence of hardship. It is the quiet decision to keep working beside one another when hardship comes. The stream flowed steadily through its new course. The forest edge remained distant but present. Wind moved through grain, like memory, through time. And the valley, once only an idea in the mind of a single man with an axe, rested into permanence, not because it never changed, but because it always did. End of the Chronicle of the Valley.